Are you out of your damn mind? You just walked right in front of my car. The screech of tires reverberated through the intersection, drawing the attention of pedestrians and nearby drivers. Marcus Reed stood frozen on the crosswalk for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly glanced at the traffic light above. It had turned red just before he'd stepped off the curb. "Sorry about that," Marcus called out, raising his hand in a calm but apologetic gesture. He stepped back onto the sidewalk, trying to defuse the situation. But the driver wasn't letting it go. The door of the sleek black BMW flung open, and a tall, middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored suit stormed out. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply on the pavement as he approached. His face was flushed with anger, and his jaw clenched as he glared at Marcus. "Sorry? Sorry, that's all you've got to say?" the man yelled, gesturing wildly toward his car. "You almost got yourself killed just now." Marcus sighed quietly. He wasn't in the mood for this. It had been a long day, and he just wanted to get home. The last thing he needed was some entitled guy blowing things out of proportion. "I didn't see the light change," Marcus explained, keeping his tone even. "It was an honest mistake. Won't happen again." "Honest mistake?" the man repeated with a sarcastic laugh. He pointed toward the traffic signal. "How do you not see that? It's right there in plain sight. Were you too busy staring at your phone or something?" Marcus shook his head. "No, I wasn't on my phone. Look, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Let's just move on." "Oh, I see," the man sneered. "You think you can just walk into traffic and expect everyone else to stop for you? People like you have no respect for the rules." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "People like you?" The words hit him harder than the man probably intended. He knew exactly what was being implied, even if it wasn't said outright. It was the kind of subtle prejudice he had encountered more times than he cared to count. "People like me," Marcus repeated, his voice quieter, but with an edge. "Don't twist my words," the man snapped, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm saying some people just don't take responsibility for their actions." Marcus felt the tension in his body increase. He glanced around and noticed that a small crowd had started to gather. People whispered to each other, watching the confrontation with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The last thing he wanted was to cause a scene. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had dealt with worse situations before. "I already apologized," Marcus said slowly. "Let's leave it at that." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, you don't want trouble now, huh? Figures. You're damn lucky I have good reflexes. If I hadn't stopped in time, you'd be lying in the street right now." Marcus met the man's eyes, but didn't respond. There was no point in arguing with someone like this. He had seen how these situations played out. Words wouldn't change the man's mindset. "Have a nice day," Marcus said, turning to walk away. "Yeah, walk away!" the man shouted after him. "That's all you people ever do, walk away from responsibility." Marcus stopped in his tracks. He felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, his fists clenching involuntarily. For a brief moment he considered turning around and confronting the man directly. But he knew it wouldn't end well. He had learned to pick his battles. Without a word, Marcus continued walking, his steps steady but tense. He kept his head high, refusing to let the man see any sign of frustration. The murmurs from the crowd followed him as he made his way down the street. Behind him, the man shook his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath as he walked back to his car. He slammed the door shut and revved the engine, clearly still fuming. As the BMW pulled away, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Some people exchanged glances, silently debating whether they should have intervened. Others shrugged and continued on with their day, the excitement already forgotten. A young woman standing near the corner turned to her friend. "Did you see that? That guy was way out of line," she whispered. "Yeah," her friend replied. "But it's not like anyone was going to step in. People don't want to get involved in stuff like that." Marcus heard snippets of their conversation as he walked away but chose to ignore it. He had other things on his mind, things that mattered more than some stranger's opinions. Still, the words lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. "People like you?" He had faced those kinds of judgments for most of his life. It didn't matter that he was a decorated police officer or that he had spent years serving his community. To some people, all they saw was his skin color. As Marcus rounded the corner and made his way toward the subway station, he shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. He had dealt with worse before. He would deal with this too. Marcus entered the precinct, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the familiar symphony of police work greeted him, phones ringing, the chatter of officers sharing notes, and the clatter of keyboards as reports were typed. It was organized chaos, the kind of controlled noise that oddly comforted him. He nodded at a few officers as he walked by, exchanging brief greetings before making his way to his desk in the corner of the squad room. His partner, Officer Sarah Martinez, was already seated, typing up a report. She glanced up as Marcus approached and immediately noticed something off. "You all right?" Sarah asked, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. Marcus dropped his duffel bag onto the floor and let out a slow breath. "Yeah, just had an interesting encounter on my way here." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Interesting how?" "You didn't get into a fight, did you?" Marcus shook his head. "No, nothing like that. Some guy nearly ran me over while I was crossing the street. He slammed on his brakes just in time, but then he got out of his car and started going off on me." Sarah snorted. "Let me guess. Business suit, expensive car, thought he was the king of the road." "Something like that," Marcus replied with a small smirk. "He was yelling about how I wasn't paying attention, how I could have gotten myself killed. It was over the top." Sarah chuckled, but the humor faded when she saw Marcus's expression darken slightly. "But that's not the part that got to you, is it?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Number." He made some comments. "The kind that stick with you." Sarah's smile faded completely. "What kind of comments?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then sighed. He said something like, "You people always walk away from responsibility." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Jesus! And he just said that out in the open?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure he didn't even realize what he was saying. Or maybe he did and just didn't care." Sarah shook her head, her frustration evident. "Unbelievable. Why didn't you tell him you're a cop? That usually shuts people up real fast." Marcus shrugged. "Because I shouldn't have to. If he's going to judge me based on what he sees, then knowing I'm a cop wouldn't change who he is. It's not my job to educate people like that." Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Still, that kind of shit pisses me off. People like him think they're better than everyone else just because they have money or power. Makes me want to deck them sometimes." Marcus chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, that's why they don't put you in charge of public relations." "Damn right," Sarah said with a grin. "So, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Marcus replied, his tone calm but firm. "It's not worth the energy. Guys like that aren't going to change because of one conversation." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I get it. Still, it's got to wear on you, dealing with that crap all the time." Marcus leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. It does. But you learn to let it roll off your back. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive. Fair enough, Sarah said. She studied him for a moment before changing the subject. Anyway, you ready for tonight's shift? We've got a meeting with Captain Grant in an hour. Marcus groaned softly. Great. Another strategy meeting. You know how much I love those? Hey, it's better than being stuck on traffic duty, Sarah pointed out. True, Marcus agreed. He glanced at the clock on the wall. There was still some time before the meeting, and he needed to clear his head. I'm going to grab a coffee, he said, standing up. You want anything? Yeah, bring me one too. Black, no sugar, Sarah replied. Marcus gave her a thumbs up and headed toward the break room. As he walked through the station, he reflected on the day's events. The encounter at the crosswalk had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the near accident, it was the reminder that in the eyes of some people, he would always be judged by surface-level assumptions. He pushed the thoughts aside as he entered the break room. There was work to be done, and he couldn't afford to let one bad encounter distract him. Ethan Parker stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him hard enough to make the frame rattle. His assistant, Karen, jumped slightly at her desk outside, hearing the commotion. Ethan's face was still red, and his jaw clenched as he tossed his briefcase onto the large mahogany desk in front of him. Karen hesitated for a moment before gently knocking on the doorframe and peeking inside. Mr. Parker? Everything all right?" Ethan exhaled sharply and began pacing the office, his hands on his hips. "Do I look all right, Karen?" he snapped before catching himself. He softened his tone a little. "Sorry. No, I'm not all right. Some idiot nearly threw himself in front of my car today." Karen raised her eyebrows, stepping cautiously inside. "Oh, no! Was anyone hurt?" "No, thankfully not," Ethan said, shaking his head. "But that's not the point. I had to slam on my brakes just to avoid hitting him, and then he acted like it was no big deal, just gave me a half-hearted sorry and walked off like nothing happened." "Maybe he was distracted," Karen offered. "People make mistakes sometimes." "Yeah, but mistakes like that can get people killed," Ethan muttered, resuming his pacing. "It's like these people have no sense of personal responsibility. He wasn't even paying attention. What if I hadn't stopped in time?" Karen crossed her arms thoughtfully. "It's good that you did, though. I mean, it could have been a lot worse. And maybe the guy didn't know how close it was." Ethan scoffed. "That's no excuse. I bet he does stuff like that all the time. You should have seen him. Acted all calm and dismissive, like it wasn't even a big deal." Karen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Do you think maybe you were just having a rough day, and that's why it got under your skin so much?" Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face her. He frowned, considering her question for a moment. "Maybe. I mean, yeah, today hasn't exactly been smooth, but still. When people do reckless things, someone has to hold them accountable. You know me, Karen. I've built my entire career on taking responsibility and demanding it from others." Karen nodded slowly. She had worked for Ethan long enough to know that he prided himself on discipline and order. He was the kind of man who thrived on structure and control, both in business and in life, but sometimes that drive for control made him rigid, too quick to judge others for not meeting his exacting standards. "Well, you didn't hit him, and no one was hurt," she said gently. "Maybe it's something to just let go of." "Maybe," Ethan mumbled, though he didn't sound convinced. He sighed heavily and walked over to the large window overlooking the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the office floor. He stood there in silence for a moment, lost in thought. Karen shifted awkwardly. "Do you want me to reschedule your 4 o'clock meeting? You seem a little—" No, Ethan interrupted, waving her off. "I'll handle it. Thanks, Karen." "All right," she replied with a small smile. "Just let me know if you need anything." Ethan nodded absently as she left the office, closing the door quietly behind her. He continued staring out the window, his mind racing. The encounter with the man at the crosswalk replayed in his head over and over. He had been so angry in the moment, but now that he was calmer, he began to question his reaction. "Did I overreact?" he muttered to himself. He replayed the man's expression in his mind, calm, unshaken, as if he had seen this kind of confrontation too many times to care anymore. Ethan's words had been sharp, even cruel. He cringed at the memory of saying, "You people." He ran a hand through his hair and sighed deeply. There was a part of him that didn't want to admit he had been wrong. He hated being wrong, but another part of him, one he rarely listened to, felt uncomfortable with how he had handled the situation. "Maybe Karen's right," he whispered. "Maybe I do need to let it go." But something about the encounter wouldn't let him move on just yet. Later that evening, Ethan was driving home along a quiet stretch of road just outside the city. The orange glow of streetlights reflected off the polished hood of his BMW. The events of the day still lingered in his mind. No matter how hard he tried to focus on other things, his meeting with investors, the growing competition in his field, his thoughts kept returning to the confrontation at the intersection. He gripped the steering wheel tighter as he replayed the scene in his head. Did I go too far? The question gnawed at him, but his pride refused to let him fully accept the answer. His thoughts were interrupted by flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. He blinked in confusion. "What the hell?" Ethan frowned and glanced at the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, muttering under his breath. The patrol car behind him slowed to a stop, its headlights illuminating the back of his BMW. Ethan sighed and rolled down his window, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. He wasn't in the mood for a ticket. A few moments later, the officer approached his window. As the officer stepped closer, Ethan caught sight of his face and immediately felt a jolt of shock. It was the man from earlier. Marcus Reed stood beside the car, his posture calm and professional. His expression was neutral, but there was a hint of recognition in his eyes. "Evening, sir," Marcus said in a steady voice. "License and registration, please." Ethan swallowed hard, suddenly feeling less sure of himself. He reached into the glove compartment, retrieved his documents, and handed them over without a word. Marcus glanced at the license before looking back at Ethan. "Mr. Parker, you know why I stopped you tonight?" Ethan shook his head. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding." "No, you weren't," Marcus confirmed. "But your left tail light is out. It's a safety issue, especially at night." Ethan exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his body. "Oh, I didn't realize it was out. I'll get it fixed." Marcus nodded. "Good. It's important to stay on top of these things. Broken lights can cause accidents." Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. He expected Marcus to hand him a ticket, but instead Marcus paused, holding the documents for a moment longer than necessary. "You recognize me, don't you?" Marcus asked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Yeah. About earlier. I might have overreacted." "Might have?" Marcus repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Okay, I did," Ethan admitted, his voice subdued. "I was having a bad day and I took it out on you. I shouldn't have said what I said."
I'm sorry.
Marcus studied him for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of his earlier arrogance pressing down on him. He hated feeling exposed like this, hated being in a position where he had to acknowledge his flaws.
You were quick to judge, Marcus said finally. But at least you're owning up to it now. Ethan nodded. I was wrong, I know that.
Marcus handed back the license and registration. Drive safe, Mr. Parker, and get that light fixed soon.
Ethan blinked in surprise. That's it? No ticket? No ticket, Marcus confirmed. I'm not here to make your life harder. Just think twice next time before you jump to conclusions. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling both grateful and ashamed. I will. Thanks. Marcus gave a brief nod and stepped back, heading toward his patrol car. Ethan sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He had gone from being the one in control earlier to the one being judged. But Marcus had handled the situation with grace, refusing to humiliate him the way Ethan had done at the intersection. As Ethan drove away, he couldn't shake the thought. What if it had been someone else? Someone who didn't give me a second chance?
For the first time in a long while, he felt the uncomfortable sting of introspection.
The next morning, Ethan sat in his office, his gaze fixed on the skyline outside his window. The usual hustle and bustle of the office seemed distant, muffled by his thoughts. He couldn't shake the memory of the previous night, Marcus's calm authority, the way he had handled the situation with professionalism and restraint. Ethan drummed his fingers on the desk, his mind racing. He hated being wrong, and admitting fault didn't come easily to him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had misjudged the man. He had been so caught up in his own frustration that he hadn't stopped to think about how his words might have affected someone else. There was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," Ethan called out, his voice sounding more tired than he intended. Karen stepped inside, carrying a stack of files. She placed them on his desk and gave him a curious look. "You seem distracted today? Everything okay?" Ethan sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Have you ever realized you were completely wrong about someone?"
Karen blinked in surprise. I guess so. Why do you ask?
"I had an encounter yesterday," Ethan said, rubbing his temple. "It made me realize how quick I am to judge people. I thought I knew everything about this guy just from a glance. Turns out I was way off." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Wow, that doesn't sound like you. You're usually pretty good at reading people."
Yeah, well, not this time, Ethan muttered. He paused for a moment, then continued. I said some things I shouldn't have. And the worst part is, I don't think I even realized how bad they sounded until after the fact.
Karen nodded slowly. "It's good that you're recognizing it now. That's more than some people ever do."
Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, I guess. But it doesn't change what I said. I can't take it back. No, but you can learn from it, Karen said gently. Nobody's perfect. The fact that you're reflecting on it means you're already doing better than most. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. He knew she was right, but it still didn't sit well with him. He prided himself on being in control, on always knowing the right thing to do. But this situation had humbled him in a way he wasn't used to.
"I need to make some changes," he murmured, almost to himself. Karen gave him a small smile. "We all do, at some point." She excused herself, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He stared at the files on his desk but found himself unable to focus. The conversation with Marcus replayed in his mind, especially the part where Marcus had said, "Think twice next time before you jump to conclusions." Ethan sighed deeply. He knew he needed to do more than just reflect. He needed to act differently moving forward. A week later, Ethan found himself standing in front of a large community centre. He had heard about the event through one of his business partners, who mentioned that the local police department was organising a community outreach program. The idea of attending had nagged at the back of his mind for days. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe closure, maybe redemption, but something compelled him to be here. The parking lot was crowded with families, vendors, and officers who were mingling with residents. Kids ran around laughing and playing, their parents chatting with police officers about safety programs. The atmosphere was lively but relaxed. Ethan walked through the event slowly, taking in the various booths and activities. One area showcased police equipment, motorcycles, patrol cars, and even a canine unit. Another section was dedicated to public safety demonstrations, with officers showing kids how to properly cross streets and follow traffic signals. He couldn't help but smirk at the irony. As he moved further into the event, his eyes landed on a familiar figure. Marcus Reed stood near a group of children, talking to them in an animated but gentle tone. He was dressed in his full uniform, and the children were clearly captivated by his presence. But remember, being responsible isn't just about following rules, it's about making sure everyone around you is safe too, Marcus said, kneeling slightly to meet the kids at eye level. You're never too young to think about how your actions affect others. The kids nodded eagerly, some of them raising their hands to ask questions. Ethan stood off to the side, observing the interaction. He saw a side of Marcus that he hadn't seen before, a leader, a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about the community. It made Ethan feel even worse about how he had treated him that day at the intersection. After the kids dispersed to play with balloons handed out by a nearby officer, Marcus straightened and noticed Ethan standing nearby. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Marcus gave a small nod of acknowledgement and walked over. "Mr. Parker?" Marcus greeted, his tone polite but reserved. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Detective Reed," Ethan replied, offering a faint smile. "I heard about the event and thought I'd stop by. Looks like a great turnout."
"It is," Marcus said. He crossed his arms casually, studying Ethan. "What brings you here, really?"
Ethan hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "Honestly, I think I owe you more than just an apology. I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day and how I acted. I was out of line." Marcus didn't say anything right away. He let the silence hang between them for a moment before speaking. "You've already apologized. What matters now is what you do going forward." "I know," Ethan said quietly, "and that's why I'm here. I need to learn how to do better. I've always been the kind of person who thinks I have everything figured out, but I don't. Not even close." Marcus's expression softened slightly. Recognizing that is a good first step. Most people never get there.
Ethan nodded. "I've been reflecting a lot. I think I've spent too much time living in my own bubble, expecting the world to operate the way I want it to. But life doesn't work like that. People have different struggles, different perspectives, and I've been blind to that for too long."
"You're not the only one," Marcus said. "We're all guilty of making assumptions sometimes. The important thing is being willing to challenge those assumptions when we're faced with the truth." Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you for being patient with me. I didn't deserve it."
Marcus shook his hand firmly. "You're welcome. Just keep learning." That's all anyone can ask.
They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing into something closer to mutual respect. In the distance, a group of officers waved Marcus over to join them for a demonstration. Marcus glanced at them, then back at Ethan. "Duty calls," he said with a small smile. "Enjoy the event." "I will," Ethan replied. "And thanks again, Detective." Marcus nodded one last time before walking off to rejoin his colleagues. Ethan watched him go, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The encounter at the intersection had been a wake-up call, one that had forced him to confront parts of himself he had ignored for too long. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Ethan wandered through the rest of the event. He listened to officers talk about community programs, watched parents and children interact with police dogs, and even struck up conversations with a few vendors. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly seeing the world around him, not just through the lens of his own ambitions and frustrations, but through the experiences of others. By the time he left the event, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He had a lot to learn, but he was ready to start the journey.